There are windows underground. Not metaphorically. Not architecturally repurposed. Windows, glass panes, stone sills, decorative frames, sitting 8, 10, sometimes 14 feet below the surface of cities that have existed for centuries. I found this while researching something else entirely. The number that stopped me was 4 feet. That's the average depth at which intact 1800s building facades have been discovered beneath the streets of at least 11 major American and European cities. 4 feet of compressed earth, gravel fill, and urban debris, sitting on top of what used to be ground level. What used to be someone's front door. The timeline isn't subtle. Let me start where most people start, with Seattle. Because Seattle is the city that doesn't hide it. You can book a tour. You can walk through the Seattle Underground and see bricked archways, old storefronts, staircases that lead to ceilings that used to be open sky. The official explanation is clean and simple. After the Great Seattle Fire of 1889, city planners decided to raise the street level by 1 to 2 stories to solve a sewage problem. The old ground floor became the new basement. Perfectly rational. Perfectly documented. And for a long time, I accepted that. But Seattle kept pulling at something. Because the more I looked, the more I realized Seattle wasn't the anomaly. Seattle was just the city that admitted it. The official story goes like this. Cities throughout history have experienced gradual accumulation of debris. Fire, flood, demolition, new construction, layers compound over centuries. Rome sits on top of Rome. Istanbul has entire Byzantine streets preserved under its foundations. This is standard archaeology. This is stratigraphy. The earth accumulates. Cities sink into their own history. There is nothing strange here, experts will tell you. There is only time. And to be fair to the official narrative, they're not entirely wrong. Accumulation is real. Stratigraphy is real. Cities do build on top of themselves. The archaeological record confirms it again and again. But here's what no one explains. Why does the accumulation appear to happen so suddenly? Why do so many of these buried layers date, with uncomfortable consistency, to a window between roughly 1810 and 1870? Why do the buried buildings, in cities across different continents, with different histories, different governments, different fire records, show the same pattern of rapid, dense burial beneath a uniform layer of sediment that looks far less like gradual accumulation and far more like deposit? The pattern is almost theatrical. Let me be fair to the official narrative one more time before I start pulling at the thread. Historians have documented what they call urban infill, the practice of raising street grades to improve drainage, manage sewage, and respond to flooding. This happened in Chicago. This happened in Portland, Oregon. This happened in St. Augustine, Florida. It happened in parts of London, in sections of Edinburgh, and in at least portions of older German and Dutch cities. The engineering explanations exist. The municipal records, where they survive, confirm deliberate grade-raising projects. This is not disputed. What is disputed, or rather, what is never quite asked out loud, is whether the grade-raising was the cause or the response. Speaking of responses, there's a detail buried in the Chicago accounts that caught my attention. When Chicago raised its street and building grades in the 1850s and 1860s, a project so ambitious that entire occupied buildings were lifted using jackscrews while people continued to live in them, the official reason given was drainage. The city sat too low. Water pooled. Disease spread. But the grading project began after years of reports describing streets that were already partially submerged. Already silted. Already presenting an elevation problem that no one could fully account for. Something had already happened to Chicago's grade before Chicago decided to fix it. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are where this gets difficult to dismiss. Edinburgh's underground vaults, the South Bridge vaults, to be precise, were built in 1788. By 1820, they were abandoned. The official explanation, too damp, too dark, too undesirable for commerce. They were sealed and forgotten. When they were rediscovered in the 1980s, researchers found not gradual water damage consistent with 2 centuries of neglect, but a thick, uniform layer of silt and debris that had entered the vaults rapidly, deposited in what geologists described as a short-duration high-volume event. 30 years. The vaults were in commercial use for perhaps 30 years before something made them uninhabitable. The South Bridge vaults sit under the Royal Mile. The Royal Mile sits at the original ground level of Edinburgh, or what everyone assumes was the original ground level. Below the vaults, there are older structures. Structures that predate the bridge. Structures that, based on their construction style, should be visible at street level. They are not. They are underground. Which brings me to the question that I cannot find a satisfying answer to. If Edinburgh's current street grade is the original street grade, if nothing dramatic altered the city's elevation in the early 1800s, then why are there pre-1788 structures sitting below it? The accumulation didn't happen slowly. Something accelerated it. Let me tell you about the mud. In multiple excavations across North American cities, documented by municipal engineering reports, some sitting in city archives and some referenced in 19th-century newspapers that have been digitized but rarely read, workers encountered a specific type of sediment. Not ash. Not construction rubble. Not the layered archaeological refuse of centuries of habitation. A uniform, fine-grained, silted deposit. Sometimes gray. Sometimes reddish. Occasionally described as having an unusual chemical composition, high mineral content, low organic matter, inconsistent with local river sediment. In Portland, Oregon, the excavation reports from the 1890s describe workers hitting this layer consistently at a depth of 4 to 6 feet across a wide section of the old city. The reports note its uniformity with some confusion. One engineer's note, preserved in the Oregon Historical Society collection, describes it as, not the product of ordinary accumulation, but offers no alternative explanation. In San Francisco, pre-earthquake survey records, some of which were damaged in the 1906 fire but partially reconstructed from copies held at Stanford, describe a similar stratum beneath the city's earliest permanent structures. Structures built in the 1850s were already being built on top of this layer, suggesting it predated the American settlement period. What deposited it? When? From where? I don't have definitive answers. Only patterns. The part that keeps me up at night is the consistency of the human record during this period. The early 1800s are not an undocumented era. We have newspapers. We have letters. We have government census records and surveying documents and church registries. The paper trail exists, and yet there are gaps. Specific, clustered gaps. Census records in multiple American cities show dramatic population anomalies in the 1815 to 1820 period. Not the kind of anomalies explained by normal migration or disease mortality. Entire enumeration districts that simply don't appear in one census and reappear, partially repopulate, in the next. Historians attribute this to counting errors, frontier instability, record-keeping inconsistency. Maybe that's exactly what it is. But the gaps cluster. They don't distribute randomly across the country the way you'd expect from organic record-keeping failures. They concentrate in low-lying areas. River cities. Coastal settlements. Places that, geologically speaking, would be most vulnerable to a rapid, large-scale inundation event. The pattern led me to keep asking a question that official history doesn't quite answer. What happened between 1811 and 1820 that left so many cities simultaneously rebuilding on top of something they never fully described? There is a document, or rather, the absence of a document, that I find significant. In the early 19th century, several American cities conducted detailed surveys of their urban geography. Street widths, building heights, land ownership, elevation relative to water level. These surveys were routine administrative exercises, the kind of bureaucratic record-keeping that normally survives because no one thinks to destroy it. For at least 7 major river cities, the pre-1820 surveys exist. The post-1820 surveys exist. The surveys from the period between approximately 1811 and 1819 are incomplete, damaged, or entirely missing. Now, there are many reasons historical documents go missing. Fire, flood, deliberate destruction, simple neglect. I am not suggesting a coordinated effort to erase a specific window of time. But I am noting that the window of missing documentation aligns with the window of sediment deposit. Aligns with the window of census gaps. Aligns with the period immediately before which we begin to see, in city after city, the decision to raise street grades to solve drainage problems that no one had previously recorded as serious concerns. The timing is almost theatrical. Let me introduce something that gets almost no attention in mainstream discussions of 19th-century urban history, the New Madrid seismic events of 1811 and 1812. These are not obscure. Every geology textbook mentions them. The New Madrid earthquakes, a series of massive seismic events centered in what is now Missouri, were among the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded in North American history. They caused the Mississippi River to temporarily flow backward. They created Reelfoot Lake where flat farmland had existed. They were felt as far away as Boston and Washington, D.C. The official historical treatment of these earthquakes focuses on their seismic character. The shaking. The land displacement. The river behavior. What receives far less attention is the hydrological consequence. A series of massive earthquakes along a major river system, in winter, affecting thousands of square miles of low-lying terrain. What happens to the water table? What happens to the river's relationship with its floodplain? What happens to the dozens of settlements sitting at or near river level across a vast stretch of the American interior? There are contemporary accounts, some preserved in letters, some in early newspaper archives held by the Library of Congress, describing water behavior in the months following the New Madrid events that doesn't match what we'd expect from purely seismic activity. Accounts of unusual flooding far from the epicenter. Of water arriving where water had never arrived before. Of low-lying areas becoming suddenly, persistently wet in ways that made them uninhabitable. Maybe the New Madrid earthquakes triggered a cascading hydrological event larger than we've modeled. Maybe the sediment layer is the physical record of that event. Maybe the census gaps and the missing surveys are the human record of communities that spent years simply trying to survive a landscape that had fundamentally changed. Maybe. 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 But the pattern connects in ways that are difficult to set aside. Speaking of connecting patterns, there's the question of the buildings themselves. When you look at photographs of the Seattle Underground, or when you examine the archaeological records from Edinburgh's vaults, or when you review the excavation reports from Portland and Chicago, you notice something that the official narrative of gradual accumulation doesn't adequately explain. The buried structures are intact. Not ruined. Not collapsed. Not the archaeological remnants of buildings that fell apart over centuries of abandonment. In many cases, not all, but many, the buried ground floors show the signs of rapid burial rather than slow decay. Walls that are still standing. Window frames that are still in place. In the Seattle Underground, there are storefronts that look as though someone simply closed up shop, walked out, and never came back, and then 8 feet of earth arrived. That is not what gradual accumulation looks like. Gradual accumulation produces ruins. It produces the collapsed, compressed, organically degraded remnants of structures that deteriorated over decades before the earth consumed them. What we find in these buried layers is different. What we find looks more like Pompeii than like Rome, the record of something that happened quickly, not slowly. I am not saying a volcano. I am not saying a single catastrophic event. I am saying that the physical evidence in the ground is more consistent with a rapid burial event than with the centuries-long gradual accumulation that the standard narrative implies. And once you see that distinction, you cannot unsee it. There is one more thread I want to pull before I step back and let you sit with this. The 1800s were a period of extraordinary construction activity across the Western world. Cities grew at unprecedented rates. Infrastructure was built on a scale that previous generations had never attempted. And yet, in city after city, the construction projects of the mid to late 1800s show a curious pattern. They are built slightly higher than the topography seems to require. Streets graded upward. Foundations poured deeper than the building load demands. Basements that seem, in retrospect, oversized for their apparent function. Was this simply good engineering practice? A response to the drainage problems that plagued 19th-century cities? Or was it something more specific, the institutional memory of builders and city planners who knew, or suspected, that the ground they were building on had recently and dramatically changed? Who were, in effect, building for a landscape they didn't fully trust? The archival record doesn't say. The engineering manuals of the period describe the technical requirements but not the reasoning behind the elevated grades. The municipal debates that surely accompanied these decisions, debates that would have referenced the specific conditions that made elevation necessary, are, in many cases, the very records that fall into the gaps I described earlier. Buried in plain sight. Or buried beneath it. I spent weeks trying to understand why this pattern isn't more widely discussed. The physical evidence exists. The archival gaps are documented. The geological anomalies are noted, individually, by researchers who study their own cities without necessarily comparing notes across geography. The answer I keep arriving at is not conspiracy. It is compartmentalization. Each city understands its own underground as a local story. Seattle's underground is Seattle's story, a fire, a practical solution, a charming tourist attraction. Edinburgh's vaults are Edinburgh's story, an 18th-century engineering project, an atmospheric piece of urban history. Chicago's grade raising is Chicago's story, an ambitious engineering achievement, a testament to 19th-century ingenuity. No one is asking whether these are all the same story. I am asking. And I don't have an answer. Only a pattern. Only the windows underground, looking out at the dirt that covered them, patient and silent and waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. What I know is this: in the 1800s, something happened to the ground level of cities across the Western world. The physical evidence is below our feet. The human record of that period has gaps precisely where we'd expect the most documentation. The buildings that were buried quickly, not slowly. And the cities that rose above them chose, collectively and consistently, to explain the old ground level as a problem to be solved rather than a mystery to be examined. The archives still exist, in parts. The Oregon Historical Society. The Library of Congress newspaper collections. The municipal engineering records in Edinburgh and Chicago and Portland. The geological surveys that noted unusual sediment and moved on. Sealed, in some cases, until researchers think to look. Accessible, in others, to anyone patient enough to read 19th-century handwriting and bureaucratic shorthand. The evidence is there. Sitting in filing cabinets. Sitting in digitized newspaper archives that almost no one searches. Sitting 8 feet below the street, behind windows that face nothing but earth. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But I've spent enough time in these records, enough time looking at buried storefronts and missing surveys and census anomalies and uniform sediment layers, to believe that the question is worth asking. What covered the old ground level? What did the people who lived through it know? And why does every city that sits on top of that buried layer tell its own small, local, entirely sufficient explanation, while the larger story remains, like the windows themselves, below the surface? I don't have answers. Only patterns. And once you see them, you cannot unsee them.